Hello again. Now let's talk about some posterior pituitary hormones. All right, so recalling from the last video lecture, the posterior pituitary hormones are actually produced by neurons up in the hypothalamus. You have a couple of clusters or nuclei of neurons up there that produce these two hormones that are considered to be posterior pituitary hormones, and then they are stored within the synaptic knobs at the ends of the axons of those neurons. Remember all that terminology from your last course. And they're secreted as needed. But their location of secretion is actually within the posterior pituitary structure. So that's why they're called posterior pituitary hormones. All right, so the two hormones are oxytocin and ladies, maybe many of you have heard of oxytocin before because there is a synthetic form called pitocin that is often given to women to induce something. And if you're thinking labor, you're absolutely right. And that is one of the main functions of this hormone in women, is to induce uterine contractions during labor. So we'll actually hear more about that function of oxytocin when we cover the reproductive system later during the semester. And then the other one is ADH, that stands for anti-diuretic hormone. Anti-diuretic hormone. Guess what? All right, so many of you, I imagine, know what a diuretic is. That's a drug or a substance that makes you urinate in larger volumes. So guess what an anti-diuretic is going to do? It's going to do the opposite. It's actually going to make you pee less. You're going to have less volume to your urine. ADH also has another name called vasopressin, and we'll talk more about that when we cover the cardiovascular system. Vaso refers to blood vessels, so you can kind of tell by the name what that's going to do. It's going to make your blood vessels constrict. And again, we'll hear about that role when we cover the cardiovascular system. So these are two hormones that fall into that amino acid category. So these are actually peptides, short chains of amino acids. There are 20 different kinds of amino acids that our cells use to make peptides and proteins by linking those amino acids together in chains. All of those amino acids have three-letter designations. And if you look closely here, this is a representation of what oxytocin looks like, and this fuzzier picture over here is a representation of what antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, looks like. And if you look closely at those three-letter abbreviations, these two hormones are chemically identical. The only place they differ is right here and right here. I knew there was a second place over here. Notice how you've got an LEU in oxytocin right there. That stands for the amino acid called leucine. And instead of that, you have ARG in antidiuretic hormone. That stands for arginine. And then up here you have ILE, that stands for isoleucine in oxytocin. And in antidiuretic hormone you have PHE, that's an abbreviation for an amino acid called phenylalanine. So these two hormones are chemically, if you looked at the actual molecules themselves and their structures, very, very similar to each other. But those little subtle differences, as is the case with lots of things in biology, makes a huge difference in the targets and the effects of these two hormones. They do very different things, even though they, if you're just looking at their chemical structures, they look very similar. All right, so what does oxytocin do? Oxytocin, as I mentioned already, is a strong stimulator of uterine contractions. So it is released during childbirth, of course, and some women need a little assistance. They're not producing enough oxytocin, or their uterine contractions are not progressing or becoming intense enough to actually deliver a child, so they wind up receiving a synthetic form of that, which is called pitocin, P-I-T with an ocin on the end. Oxytocin is also a hormone that triggers milk ejection. All right, so in females, you have mammary glands that produce breast milk, okay? And what oxytocin does, you have smooth muscle tissue that surrounds those glands, and when that muscle tissue contracts, it actually squeezes the milk towards the nipple. All right, so that's the role of oxytocin. Oxytocin triggers milk letdown, where the milk actually gets squeezed toward the nipple so the infant will have access to the milk. So oxytocin does not trigger milk production. The milk is already there. It's back in here in those portions of the mammary glands. Oxytocin triggers squeezing that milk toward the nipple so the infant has access to it. All right, and let's look at what triggers oxytocin secretion. All right, so you got to have some sort of a stimulus to trigger its production. So a suckling infant, a nursing infant, is the stimulus that's going to trigger oxytocin production. So there are nervous tissues, sensory nervous tissues around the nipples of a female that pick up on suckling of an infant, and they generate action potentials. They send those upward towards the hypothalamus in the brain. These nerve impulses wind up being carried up to the hypothalamus. They get detected there, and then you have neurons up in the hypothalamus that have made oxytocin, and that oxytocin winds up getting secreted out of the posterior pituitary. So it enters the bloodstream. The bloodstream carries these oxytocin molecules all throughout a woman's body, but one of the main targets is in these mammary glands. Lobules, it says mammary lobules there on the diagram. Those are little compartments, like little subcompartments in the mammary glands where milk is produced. So as I mentioned, you've got smooth muscle tissues surrounding those little milk-filled compartments, and they contract, and that squeezes the milk towards the nipple so that the infant can suckle on it and receive the milk. Okay, so remember I was mentioning for all of the different hormones as you go through them, you want to keep up with some information about it. So our hormone here is oxytocin. What's the stimulus? What stimulates production? So we said that's the suckling of the infant. What gland produces it? You can kind of go either way with this. It's actually cells in the hypothalamus that make it, but it's secreted from the posterior pituitary. So you have to be kind of careful with the wording with regard to this hormone. Where is it produced? Where is it secreted? And then the target or the targets. So we just talked about the mammary glands. We also talked about the walls of the uterus, the muscle tissues in the uterus that have to contract when an infant is born. Those would also be target tissues. And then what are the response or the responses? Milk letdown, contraction of the uterus. That is why many women report when they are nursing an infant that they'll have some uterine contractions, some mild uterine contractions that occur while that's happening. Oxytocin has some other roles as well. It does function as a neurotransmitter in the brain. It's thought to be one of the main hormones involved with feelings of bonding. So like when a mother is bonding to a nursing infant, but also bonding between males and females, as well as one of those feel-good kind of bonding hormones. And interestingly, I've even read where oxytocin is when you're petting your dog, the dog actually releases more oxytocin, which winds up stimulating feelings of bonding within the brain. So this is not just a human hormone, and as is the case with many of these hormones, there are multiple roles for oxytocin. Keep in mind as we go through the endocrine system as well, the endocrine system's pretty complex. A lot of these hormones have multiple functions, and no doubt we don't know what all of the functions for some of these hormones are. Okay, so the other posterior pituitary hormone is ADH, also known as antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. That term is used more so when you're thinking about the cardiovascular system and blood pressure regulation, as we'll see later. So what does this do? It's an anti-diuretic, which means it inhibits or prevents urine formation. It helps regulate your water balance. All right, so if ADH is present in a higher concentration in the blood, its impact is going to be on the kidneys. So the kidneys produce urine. This hormone signals the kidneys not to produce as much urine, don't release as much water in the urine. And instead, that water gets reabsorbed back. When we study the urinary system at the end of the semester, you'll see this term reabsorbed quite a bit. So that means that the water which is in the urine that's developing in the kidneys actually gets reabsorbed back out into the tissues of the kidney and then on back into the blood vessels that are passing through those tissues. Remember, always keep in mind in this class, fluids move from compartment to compartment. That's a very important concept. So the water winds up moving back into the bloodstream, and then it can be carried to various tissues throughout the body. Some other things that can trigger ADH release. All right, so what is going to be the main trigger? Guess what your main trigger would be? High blood osmoticity. You'll see some different terms for that, like osmolarity, which you may have learned a little bit about in Biology 201. That's referring to the solute concentration of your body fluids. A higher osmolarity, osmosis refers to the movement of water across cell membranes. That is influenced by solute concentrations. So a high blood osmolarity or osmoticity here on this diagram means your solutes are more concentrated. Well, guess what that means if you have higher solute concentrations? That means your water levels are lower. If your body is becoming dehydrated, then things like solutes like sodium and calcium and glucose and amino acids and things like that floating around in your body fluids are going to be more concentrated. There's not going to be as much water there separating those solutes from each other. So you have neurons in the hypothalamus that are capable of detecting that. That's the stimulus. They realize that the solute concentrations have gotten higher, and that triggers them to produce and secrete ADH out of the posterior pituitary. This diagram has it flipped, so the posterior pituitary is on the left and the anterior pituitary is on the right. So don't be surprised as you see that flip back and forth from diagram to diagram. Some other things that can trigger ADH release: pain, low blood pressure. There are certain drugs that can trigger this to be released as well. Low blood pressure, why would that trigger? Let's think about this. Why would that trigger secretion of ADH? So think about it. If you're getting dehydrated, what's that going to do to your blood volume? If you have less water in your blood volume's going to go down. So think about your blood vessels like you would a garden hose. If you have a lower blood volume, what's that doing to your blood pressure? It's lowering your blood pressure. Blood pressure is one of the most critical aspects of homeostasis. It has to be regulated very closely. So what's one of the things that you could do to raise your blood pressure if you need to? You need to bring your blood volume back up. How do you bring your blood volume back up? You need to increase water levels in the blood. So this is actually one of the key hormones that's made to help hold on to more water in your tissues and in your blood. It helps prevent dehydration. So if you do that, that's going to cause your blood volume to go back up, and then your blood pressure's going to go back up. So you're going to see lots of stories like this in Biology 202, where one step leads to the next and leads to the next. So get used to that, and also get used to learning those stories and trying to understand how those things work. That is what's going to serve you the best in this particular course. or really all of your courses. That's a very good thing to do, to really study, to understand how things work as step-by-step processes. All right, interestingly, some things that inhibit ADH. Alcohol, diuretics. So now we already mentioned that diuretics are drugs that cause you to pee more. They increase your urine volume, so that makes sense that diuretics are going to counteract or inhibit this particular hormone. But here's, interestingly, alcohol. So now I know none of you would have any experience with this, but maybe you know somebody who, from time to time drinks a little alcohol, and what happens to your, well, not you, but their frequency of urination goes up a lot when you consume, not even a lot, it doesn't even take a lot of alcohol. A fairly low level of alcohol will cause you to pee a whole lot more. And the reason for that is alcohol inhibits ADH function and secretion. So you produce less of it. The kidneys are not able to reabsorb water back out of the urine and into your bloodstream and tissues. So you wind up peeing more. Your urine volume goes up. ADH also, in very high concentrations, so when there's a lot of it being secreted out of the posterior pituitary, it triggers vasoconstriction. So that's where it gets its other name, vasopressin. And now think about what happens to your blood pressure if you constrict the walls of or think about a garden hose. If you press on the walls of the garden hose, water pressure goes up. Same thing with your blood vessels. If you constrict the walls of blood vessels, your blood pressure goes up. So that's another way that ADH can help raise your blood pressure when needed. All right, so I will let you guys think about these questions down here, and you can post on the discussion board on Blackboard. If you're not sure, what's the stimulus for ADH, the targets and the responses. Those are the types of things you want to be keeping in mind as you proceed through this particular unit. A couple of interesting disorders, and check Blackboard for information about critical thinking or application type assignments I may have made for you with regard to disorders. I'm not going to mention anything specific here because I might change it from semester to semester. But there are a couple of interesting ADH disorders. This one, you guys moving into healthcare will likely have patients who have this from time to time. Diabetes insipidus. So this is not diabetes like high blood sugar diabetes. This is a different type of diabetes. This term diabetes actually refers to frequent urination. Okay, and so people who have the types of diabetes where they experience problems controlling their blood sugar levels, they also tend to pee a lot. But diabetes insipidus is an ADH disorder that causes patients to pee a lot. This can also be called DI as an abbreviation, diabetes insipidus. This is an ADH deficiency, which could be due to the hypothalamus being damaged, or maybe the posterior pituitary has been damaged or is not functioning for some reason, like maybe a patient has been injured in some way. All right, so if you don't produce ADH, all right, so we said ADH lowers urine volume. So guess what? If you don't produce ADH, then whammo, you're not going to be able to reduce your urine volume. Your urine volume is always going to be high. So the main symptom of DI would be excessive urination. Now what's that going to do to somebody? They're going to be dehydrated. If you're peeing out lots and lots of your body water, you're going to be dehydrated. It's going to be very difficult for you to stay hydrated. You can even extend it from there. What's that going to do to your blood pressure? If you're peeing out your body water in an out of control manner all the time, your blood pressure is going to be low because of that, and that can lead to additional problems. Okay, then there's another ADH disorder, which is abbreviated as SIADH, Syndrome of Inappropriate ADH Secretion, so you can see why they just call it SIADH. And now here you're overproducing ADH. So this is excess ADH. So these patients are going to have the opposite problems. You're going to retain too much fluid. They may have headaches. They may be disoriented. Think about, all right, so we said it, if you're retaining water in one body fluid compartment, that water is going to move into every other compartment, intracellular or extracellular. And again, if you guys don't remember what you learned about in AMP1 with regard to body fluids and compartments, you need to go back and look through that information. So think about like in your cerebrospinal fluid, if you have excess water in there, the cerebrospinal fluid surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. That's going to lead to headaches. It can lead to disorientation. Your electrolyte levels are going to be off because they have to be maintained in particular concentration. So if you have too much water in your body fluids, they're going to get too diluted out. So treatments for this fluid restriction, you actually are not supposed to drink quite as much, and then the sodium levels have to be monitored very closely. You guys learned about how important sodium is when you studied the muscular and the nervous system, so the sodium levels have to be very closely monitored for proper body functions. Okay, so those were the two posterior pituitary hormones. The next couple of lectures we'll talk about the anterior pituitary hormones and what some of their interesting functions and disorders are.